How much do you think where you were born defines who you are? Here's a thought experiment. What would happen if you were born, say, 1,000 kilometers south of where you were? Well, you might have a completely different nationality. But not only that, you would now also be governed by a completely different set of laws. Whether or not you could travel and where would also be determined by a completely different set of rules. And all of this information would be based on within which imaginary boundaries you were born in. We have undoubtedly moved from a world where states are surrounded by boundaries to a world in which states are surrounded by barriers. But what has sparked this increase in the number of militarized borders globally? And why do we have borders in the first place? Today, we'll be turning our attention to America and its highly politicized border with Mexico to try and answer these questions, and to delve into the complex discussion of wealth, privilege, and protection. This is Motion, a podcast about migration in the 21st century. Like always, I want to take a step back for a moment. We don't exactly question the borders we live in, or at least I don't anyway. When I think of the borders that define our countries, I tend to take them for granted. I imagine them as natural things that have sort of always existed. In reality, however, the concept of borders and defined states are relatively new, having really only emerged in the past few hundred years. Scholars usually trace the origins of the modern state to the Peace of Westphalia of 1648. These treaties ended the 30-year War in Europe, ending an unstable period of European history which saw the deaths of nearly 8 million people. With these treaties came the principle that each nation-state had exclusive sovereignty over its territory. Furthermore, external powers could not interfere in another country's domestic affairs. Each country, no matter how large or small, had equal rights to sovereignty. And this represented a very new way of thinking about the relationship between countries and land. Now fast forward to the 20th century.
We live, we are told, in a modern age. Modernity is logistical, modernity is a world in motion, expressed in translations of strategic space into logical time, and back again.
That's Dr. William O'Reilly, a faculty of history at the University of Cambridge, and also a senior fellow of the Institute of Advanced Study at Central European University. I was lucky enough to hear him present a talk at Central University in Budapest, which he titled Hopeful Journeys, Resting Places in the History of European Migration. We'll be hearing segments of his talk throughout today's podcast. For most of the 20th century, borders were lines on maps that were only heavily guarded when states were at war with their neighbours. Most countries did not invest heavily in border security infrastructure. It's only in the last 20 years or so that the United States, the European Union, and dozens of other countries have built walls on their borders to prevent the movement of people and goods into and out of their territories. In contrast to most of history, today the majority of humans are born in defined states and live in a city in which their daily activities are monitored by agents of that state, including police, judges, and bureaucrats. The point I'm trying to make is that, too often, the system of states is framed as somehow a reflection of the basic nature of the world, rather than a set of agreed-upon arrangements. When the Berlin Wall fell a quarter of a century ago, there were 16 guarded borders in the world. Today, there are 65. So let's turn now to the US-Mexican border. The border between the United States and Mexico spans nearly 2,000 miles, crossing a total of 6 Mexican and 4 US states. This border, separating Mexico and the United States, is the most frequently crossed international boundary in the world, with approximately 350 million legal crossings occurring annually. But the reason this border receives so much attention is not because of the number of legal crossings that occur there, it's because of the number of illegal crossings. There is no official measure of how many people succeed in illegally crossing the border, but authorities have used the number of apprehensions to gauge some sort of number. According to the US Border Control, arrests at the border peaked in 2000 at 1.64 million and have generally declined since. In the past, the US has paid significantly less attention to its southernmost border. The boundary wasn't transformed into a barrier until 1924, when the US founded the Border Patrol Agency. In these early days, the Border Patrol was small and underfunded, with a total of only 450 agents. But since the mid-1990s, the US has gradually upped its security measures, installing hundreds of miles of steel fencing into the wall. In 2006, President George W. Bush signed the Secure Fence Act. The act enabled the creation of more than 1,000 kilometers of fencing at the US-Mexican border. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, both senators at the time, voted in approval of this project. By 2010, the Border Patrol had more than 20,000 agents. This patrolling of the border has worked, depending on how you define success. In 2012, Border Patrol agents made over 364,000 arrests of people illegally entering the country. But for some, this isn't enough. In 2016, then presidential candidate Donald Trump stood controversy by campaigning on a platform that included building a wall to cover the remaining 2/3 of the US-Mexican border that was unfenced.
We will build a great wall along the southern border.
The goal, President Trump argued, was to further secure America's borders against those who wished to enter it illegally. Oh, and Mexico was going to pay for it.
And Mexico will pay for the wall.
I think President Trump's argument for why the US needs this wall is a reflection of the most common reasons given for why countries are increasingly creating militarized fences along their borders. And that argument is security. That is, the protection of the sovereignty of a state from internal and external threats. But if President Trump wants to secure US borders, what about its border to the north, the one that divides the United States from Canada? There are customs and passport checkpoints along those border crossings, but there are also long stretches between official checkpoints that remain open and mostly unguarded. The United States is not worried about illegal Canadians. It's worried about illegal Mexicans. So, what's the difference? Here's the obvious, uncomfortable answer. Canada's GDP per capita is 5 times that of Mexico's. So, America is less worried about Canada because it's seen as unlikely that low-income workers from that country will try to move south. There is a powerful idea, according to Rhys Jones in their book Violent Borders, that violence at borders is inevitable when less developed countries are situated next to developed ones. And I want to analyse why we have this perception. In episode 2 of this podcast, we talked about economic migrants, those who are escaping poor living conditions and job prospects as a side effect of a rapid move from rural to urban development. Wealth gaps, according to Jones, combined with a new round of demographic and economic change, are driving new global migration as the poor look for better opportunities elsewhere. But America doesn't seem to want this. The logic is that American businesses should employ American people. Every poor immigrant who takes one of these jobs leaves one less for an American citizen. So the goal is to keep out the masses who flock to the border.
But this proletarian horde, as they're recorded in the late 19th century historical narrative, were always seen at the gate, about to break down the fortress or castle or city or state. And this mass or riot, never just a group of people but always one collective noun, came to be seen as a menace, a load of unpredictability and ferocity. This mass needed, we're told, to be domesticated. And we see it all too often too when people are reduced, as I've said already, to a mass or to a riot, herded and corralled like undomesticated beings.
And it's this sentiment that we can see today at the US-Mexican border. In 2018, Donald Trump ordered a crackdown on unauthorized immigration from Central America.
Breaking tonight, a showdown at the border, the likes of which we really have not seen, as President Trump calls for our military to get down there and protect it, and links all of this to the future of NAFTA.
With this new enforcement policy came the requirement that every adult caught entering the US illegally be detained and referred to the Justice Department for criminal prosecution. That's even if they intended to claim for asylum. The worst of America, however, was seen in its treatment of immigrant children. Senator Jeff Merkley visited one of the detention centers set up for unaccompanied children in Texas. He described it as looking like a dog kennel.
What you have is cyclone fencing and fence posts that look like cages. They look like the way you would construct a dog kennel.
Now, Jones goes as far to argue that today's militarized borders are a part of a greater long-term effort to control the movement of the poor. Quote, in the era of globalization, as the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest states have grown, states around the world have deployed new security infrastructure along borders designed to detect and prevent the movement of the world's poor. End quote. But Dr. William O'Reilly takes this sentiment one step further, suggesting that by controlling movement, we essentially control access to privilege.
People were held outside. They were denied entry. They were forced to wait for an opportunity to partake, to participate, to belong. Access to movement was access to privilege.
Today, visa requirements allow for the selective exclusion of individuals whom a state would prefer not to have to accommodate. And it's this control of movement, of privilege, which has enabled countries to accumulate privilege through the containment of the poor and the protection of the wealthy. I think the sentiment is most resonant when you look at an image of the US-Mexican border wall. Just go to Google to find one. On one side, you have America, a townscape, a highway running parallel to the wall. On the opposite side, you have Mexico, with vast expanses of green hills, and a single building, likely a transit zone. Walls and borders are a passive expression of power, reflecting a conflict between the desire for freedom and the desire for control.
It's only relatively recently that speed and politics have come to be employed as techniques to exercise power in these resting places of migration. So I think we can see that those who are forced to wait, whose trajectory of movement is punctuated by the slowing down of time, have access to modernity removed from them. When speed and expedition are taken away, they are denied access in the current terms of politics to what it means to be modern, and in this sense, they are denied their very being.
It's a paradox, with the border acting as both a conduit and obstacle of movement, the applicability of each term relying solely on a measure of one's privilege. I'm quoting directly from Justin Chancon's report in the International Socialist Review. For American capitalists, investors, tourists, and retirees, the US-Mexican border provides access. For Mexicans, the majority of whom cross to seek economic opportunities in low-wage industries, the border imposes exclusion, a barrier to the future that is made unobtainable. Here's the interesting revelation I had while writing this script. Without states, refugees, as we broadly understand them, would not exist. So really, refugees are the product of a system of states, rather than threats to it. Today, the world is more global than we have ever seen. More than ever, people are proactively deciding where to live, where to study, and where to work. Movement, a privilege that was once only exclusively available to the global elite, is now becoming accessible to more and more of the people we once tried to deprive it from. And this expansion in access to movement challenges our very ideas of borders and countries. Migrants every day challenge this notion by moving between boundaries and as such blurring the idea of a state. And by challenging this idea, they are challenging our idea of privilege and one's identity. But what do people do when their very sense of being is questioned? They turn to those who are similar and reject those who are different. Next time on Motion, populism. You can find a full transcript of this podcast, along with a bibliography and links to referenced articles on Motion's website. Motion's music is produced by Kevin MacLeod. Thank you to Sarah Pollock for designing Motion's graphics.